It is my pleasure tonight to welcome our guest speakers, Rabbi Amy Eilberg and Professor Louis Newman, to our bima in just a moment. Don't get up yet. First and foremost, I am most excited that they are here because they are speaking and I am not, which I am immensely grateful to you both for agreeing to speak on this particular Shabbat. Nor is Rabbi Nambi or Rabbi Nematov, so thank you for letting us off the hook. And Kal v'chomer, as they say in rabbinic tradition, all the more so, they are both wonderful people and have a really important talk to give tonight. A bit about Rabbi Eilberg, who is the first woman ordained as a conservative rabbi by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. She serves as a spiritual director, peace and justice educator, and teacher of Musar. She serves as chair of the Racial Justice Subcommittee of the Conservative Movement's Social Justice Commission, and has a wonderful book called From Enemy to Friend, Jewish Wisdom and the Pursuit of Peace. And Professor Louis Newman, who happens to also be Rabbi Amy Eilberg's husband, they come as a pair, though not always, is a renowned scholar of Jewish ethics, taught at Carleton College for more than 30 years before serving as the Dean of Academic Advising and Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at Stanford from 2016 to 2022. He's the author of the book Repentance, The Meaning and Practice of Teshuvah, which you may recall we spent all of Elul reading last month before welcoming Professor Newman here at Beth Am for Slichot last year as our preparation for the High Holy Days. And his most recent book is called Thinking Critically in College, The Essential Handbook for Student Success. Their talk tonight, Dr. Newman is also the chair of the New Israel Fund's Regional Council here in our area. And their talk tonight is called Experiencing Grief, Pursuing Justice, Doing Collective Teshuvah, A View from Israel. Rabbi Eilberg and Dr. Newman, it is a pleasure to welcome you back to our Beth Am bima.
Well, thank you so much for the lovely invitation. Yes, I'm well aware that you were doing us a favor by inviting us here, and there was a little bit of our giving something back to the very, very weary rabbis. Yeah. So I have to say that this talk may not contribute to the tone of happiness that the rabbis and the cantors invited as the primary energy for tonight. We're here to talk about a trip that we took to Israel and a little bit to the West Bank at the end of May. So, it used to be that 4 months, we could remember 4 months ago. But it seems like it's been about a decade of events since even about a month ago. We've been attacked. We've attacked back. Questions. Israel is at war on multiple fronts. Tremendous fear about what's happening with Iran. So what we're going to give you is, in a way, a snapshot of what we saw and felt and heard in Israel and to some extent on the West Bank at the end of May. And some of the things that we saw are still true. Some of the tone, there's a whole different level of differently directed set of reasons for anxiety in Israel than there was then. But you'll hear. And the other thing that's different, of course, is that this is Shabbat Shuvah. And so as Louis and I looked back at our notes about what we learned, the theme of tshuva is really very, very relevant to the things that we learned, both about having descended into the heart of some of the things that are really troubling in Israel, that were troubling in Israel before October 7th and since, and also an inspiring look at some of the really heroic peace and justice seekers in Israel and Palestine, who I dare say even now in October are doing their very best to exemplify human values and Jewish values. So if there's not sort of happy, clappy sort of energy from this. I hope there will be at least some sense of hope and perhaps even inspiration.
I want to begin by just saying a little bit about the overall type of trip that we were on and a little bit about the New Israel Fund for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The New Israel Fund has been around for more than 40 years. It supports a whole range, many dozens of progressive nonprofit organizations in Israel devoted to things like safeguarding democracy, upholding human rights, promoting social and economic equality, equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, advancing shared society, that is Jewish-Palestinian shared society initiatives, issues of religious pluralism, particularly for the non-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and they support a number of progressive think tanks as well. If I dare say there's any organization in Israel working in the areas of human rights and civil rights and coexistence and religious pluralism, it either is or has been supported by the New Israel Fund. It also includes a whole branch, an element of the New Israel Fund is called Shatil, which is its capacity building, because the New Israel Fund long ago figured out that just handing out money to organizations wasn't enough. They had to actually help these organizations get rooted, get organized, build capacity, so that they could do their work even more effectively. And since October 7th of last year, of course, the New Israel Fund has been involved for the first time in some direct service work. So for people who were displaced by the terrorist attacks, New Israel Fund stepped in when, frankly, in many cases, the government was missing in action, and helped find places for people to stay, food for people to eat, and so forth. Amy and I have been on a number of New Israel Fund study tours over the years. The purpose of these tours is to bring people like us, who've been supporters of the New Israel Fund, to the country, give us a chance to meet with the representatives of some of the organizations that the New Israel Fund supports, and in a certain way help us sort of commit ourselves to the work that they do, but also learn from people on the ground really what's happening in the moment. A couple of quick examples, just so you have a sense of what these organizations are. ACRI, which is the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, which you might think of as the ACLU of Israel, one of the flagship grantees of the New Israel Fund. There's something called the Civil Society Protection Hub, which works to help all sorts of activists when they get attacked and threatened by people on the far right. Mechazkim, which means strengthening, which is an organization that does political content online. They have a very elaborate online political content platform. Mitvim, which is a think tank, which works on, its mission is to improve Israel's foreign policy. And I could go on and on. There are dozens and dozens of these organizations, and the New Israel Fund is central to all of them. The last thing I'll just say, by way of just sort of giving you a sense of the maybe emotional tone of the trip, I always say when I come back from these trips that it is both depressing and inspiring. It is depressing because you really see up close the very, very entrenched problems in Israeli society. It is not all blue and white, singing Hatikva, dancing the Hora. It's not that. And at the same time, you are meeting with the social activists and justice activists who get up every morning and fight the hard fight to make Israel the kind of democracy that they believe it ought to be and that we want it to be. And in that sense, it's deeply inspiring.
So we'll give you just a couple of snapshots of the people and the kinds of people, the kind of categories of work that we witnessed and learned about. One category for sure is activists in the human rights community, all of whom are supported monetarily and humanly, existentially, by the New Israel Fund. We spent some incredible hours with people, Israeli Jews who do human rights work related to Gaza, to Gazan, the access that people in Gaza have to food and water and medical care. One is called Gisha, which means access in Hebrew, and one is called Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. We were sitting in the presence of people who were experts in every element, the ins and outs of what gets into Gaza and what can't get into Gaza, what Israeli law allows and what doesn't allow, what international law allows and what international law actually does not allow, why the Israeli government thinks that they can hold back certain kinds of aid. And in a number of cases, these organizations, Gisha and Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, have brought cases to the Supreme Court of Israel and succeeded in telling the Israeli government that some of the things that they were doing were in fact not in alignment with international law. And we met with one of my favorite activists in Israel, now Rabbi, just recently ordained Rabbi Avi Dabush. I could go on at some length, who's the executive director of Rabbis for Human Rights. Himself, he grew up Mizrahi, Likud family, sort of right-wing, lived much of his life not in the fancy northern suburbs of Tel Aviv, but in the what's called the periphery in Israel, the small towns in the Negev, and has really learned what it means to do justice work side by side and shoulder to shoulder with Palestinian citizens of Israel in partnership with the Israeli Jews of the area. Avi and his family were in their safe room in, well, now I'm blanking, Kibbutz Nirim for 12 hours on October 7th, waiting for the army to come. They eventually came as little children, aged 7 and 5, who somehow kept quiet through all those hours, released. The people of the kibbutz have now been evacuated, he among them, and yet still he is on every bima, on every raised platform, calling out the message of the prophets, the message of Jewish tradition in favor of peace, working with Palestinian citizens of Israel to say, we need to do something differently. We need to hold up an image of peace and justice for this land.
Back in May in particular, but it continues to be true today, one of the things that's most striking when you visit Israel were the protests and the signs. Just as there are here, I noticed them in the foyer as I walked in. There are signs literally everywhere. You can scarcely walk 50 feet anywhere in the country without seeing signs about bringing the hostages home. It is an overpowering experience everywhere you look. There are also mass protests that happened. We were in Tel Aviv on a Saturday night, and we joined one of those protests with thousands upon thousands of people as far as you could see filling the main thoroughfare in Tel Aviv, protesting against the government, protesting to push the government to make a deal. Iska achshav, they said, a deal now, make a deal now, whatever it is, bring our hostages home. There is no price too high to pay. It has to happen now. And this was the theme over and over again that we heard from many, many people. Some of those signs were particularly poignant. One of them, there were hundreds and hundreds of them, and people wearing T-shirts, and I could go on about the signs themselves. If we had audio-visual here, I could put up pictures of some of those signs. But one in particular was read Am Chatuf Be'artzenu, which translates a people captive in its own land, referring to the sense that the people have that they've been held captive. The entire nation, not just the hostages, the entire nation has been held captive. And it's particularly poignant because it's a play on the words of Hatikva, the national anthem, Am Chofshi Ba'artzenu, a free people in our land, right, which is the goal and the dream of the Zionists. So that was among the more powerful experiences we had. In addition, we went to a smaller protest of the hostage families the following day. They happen every single day on that spot at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. They walk out onto the main thoroughfare, they stop traffic, and they start a count. Today is one day of the hostages in the hell of Gaza. 2 days of the hostages in the hell of Gaza, and they continue to count until they get to whatever day it is. We're now reaching, of course, 365 days. That takes some time, and it is immensely powerful simply to recite the number of days that the hostages have been held captive. That will, I think, stay with me for the rest of my life. I'll go on to talk just very briefly about a couple of other things. I should have said earlier, if you're interested in more information about the New Israel Fund, you'll find it on the table next to the water. I'm looking at it straight back through the main doors to the sanctuary. Feel free to take any of that literature home with you. But among the things that we saw that were particularly disturbing, there were low points. We went to a place called Wadi Khalil, which is a small Bedouin village, which...
In the south of Israel.
In the south of Israel. These are Israelis. They are Israeli citizens, Bedouin citizens of Israel. They have rights. They vote in Israeli elections. They also have they're a depressed and impoverished community, by and large. They live in very small villages. And there was a particular place that we went where we visited one of these villages, which was in ruins. Why was it in ruins? Because the Israeli government had decided that they wanted to build an extension of a highway that would go through that place where the village sat. The village, by the way, is probably smaller than the area on which Beth Am sits, if you take the entire campus that we're sitting in. That's how large this area is. The people in the village protested. They didn't want to move. The government offered to move them. They didn't want to move. They fought a battle in court, and they lost. And the court basically said, the government offered to move you, even though you didn't want to go to the place the government offered you. Still, you have to move, and if you don't move, the government has the right to raise the village, which they did. So the village was in ruins. The highway has not been built. The money for the highway has not even yet been allocated. But the people have been forced to leave the village that they lived in for generations. We visited another small town in the Negev, which I won't go into, not in the Negev, I apologize, in the West Bank, a Palestinian village called Susia, which has a long and very complex history. But the bottom line is that this is a small Palestinian village surrounded by many Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and we met there with a human rights activist. We couldn't meet in his home as planned. They were planning to serve us lunch in their home. But the army, spontaneously, because we were there and because one of the settlers got angry with us, decided to call the army, and they declared it what they call a closed military zone, which meant we weren't allowed to go into the village, notwithstanding the fact that there are people moving back and forth all the time. That said, we sat by the edge of the road at the entrance to the village and listened to Nasser talk about the ways in which the current situation on the West Bank is unlivable, basically, for Palestinians. And that was an enormously powerful experience as well.
Now comes the really hopeful part. The peace activists who always make my heart sing, but under these circumstances, even more so. We met a man named Maoz Inon, who is now a world-renowned peacemaker. He had been a kind of interfaith entrepreneur in the north, in Nazareth, trying to bring Jews and Christians and Muslims together in the depressed city of Nazareth. His parents lived in the town of, not near, in Netiv HaSara, and he found out right away that they were incinerated in their home. He learned that immediately. And on the night of October 8th, as he tells the story, he had a dream that he and other people were standing on the land with tears flowing down their faces and their bodies, and then the tears turned into blood, and the blood soaked the earth and somehow nourished the earth, and the blood then extended in the direction of a path, and he woke up on October 9th and realized that he had been invited to walk the path of peace. And at first, he asked himself, how am I supposed to know how to do this? And then he realized that everything that he needed to do this work, he had already been given by his parents. And so he has been all around the world. He and a Palestinian partner had an audience with the Pope. They have a TED Talk. They've been in every place imaginable. They created one of the largest peace collaborative Israeli-Palestinian peace events in history with an inspiring image, vision. And he says you can't get from where we are now to someplace radically new without articulating a vision and a dream. And the dream is that if, even though it looks unlikely on the ground right now, if we could actually look one another in the eye and see that the others are human beings, we are human beings, we all want the same things for our lives, for our children, for our families. We need to do something different now because what we've been doing for the last 100 years is not helping anyone. We met with Jonathan Zeigen, whose name perhaps you've also heard. His mother was Vivian Silver, one of the most beloved and best known peacemakers in all of Israel. She was involved in co-creating almost every collaborative Israeli-Palestinian peace organization that you could think of. One that comes to mind is Women Wage Peace, but many others as well. She lived in Kibbutz Be'eri, which of course you've heard of. At first it was thought that she'd been taken captive, and people all over the world were praying for her and imagining, because she was such a gifted relationship person. People imagined that she was kind of making peace with her captors, and there was all kinds of images about what Vivian was doing in captivity, except it turned out that she had been killed in her own home. And her son, who had not been a peacemaker by training, he kind of teased his mom, oh, gee, Mom, can't you just be like a grandmother like everybody else now at this point in your life? Realized after they got up from Shiva, having learned, in fact, that she had died, that he had to set aside the life that he had had before and become a full-time peacemaker as well. And he, too, speaks this extraordinarily inspiring language that we've all had truths that we've held in our heads, and they have led us astray. And it turns out they actually weren't true. All the stories about hate and impossibility are only true to the extent that we repeat them to ourselves, and that Palestinians repeat those same stories to ourselves. And there is no way from here to there by military action. We heard over and over again on this trip, there is no military solution to this conflict. I won't ask you, but I'm tempted to have us all sort of recite, there is no military solution to this conflict. The only way that there can be a solution eventually, we're obviously, God knows, very far from that right now, is by talking, is by investing particularly the Jewish genius that we're so proud of, investing not in military and not only, of course, we need to continue to protect ourselves until the day when peace comes, but until we invest in a different kind of vision. And finally, these people are all my favorites, a young woman named Mai Pundak, whose father was also a world-class peacemaker involved, really an architect of the Oslo Accords, who runs an organization called A Land for All, which perhaps improbably, it's taken me some time to convince Louis that this was really something worth considering. The image is of creating in the Middle East something like the EU. 2 states with boundaries, borders, with security arrangements for sure, but with relatively open borders so that you don't have to move 500,000 Jewish settlers out of the West Bank, which is one of the reasons why a 2-state solution is impossible right now. We're not going to move 500,000 Jewish settlers from the West Bank, but this is a way of imagining that there will be 2 states, in Israel and Palestine, but you can live in Hebron, outside of Hebron, and be a citizen of Israel. Or you can visit Haifa. You can visit as a Palestinian. You can spend time living with your family in Haifa, but be a citizen of Palestine. So a whole new idea of what 2 states would look like, with somewhat porous, safe but somewhat porous borders, and eventually some kind of umbrella structure that would govern some aspects of the lives of people there. Does this sound unlikely? Maybe at the moment where we find ourselves today, perhaps it does. And Mai Pundak just loves to say we are never going to get to a different kind of place until we have a different kind of vision. And we need at least to be allowing our brains and our hearts to imagine that something else is actually possible, if there's any chance for this war to be the last war. And so I want to conclude with two things that leapt off the page at me from your Siddur. One is the following: help us to live with fear and conquer rage. Heal the hate that makes us kill, I would add, that makes other people kill us, surely, and that makes us kill. Oh God, bring some kind of healing so that all of this rage, all of this hate, all of the dying, and all of the killing can be healed and turned into something radically different, which is peace and justice for all the people of this land, so that all people may be safe and all people may be free. And I dare say, may it be that even in this year to come, that there will be some progress with God's help to remember us all for life, all the people of the region and all of the Jewish people, that we be remembered for life, for blessing, and for peace. Thank you so much. Shabbat shalom, Shana tova.